Hey guys, and tonight we're diving headfirst into the glittering but murky world of the Roaring Twenties. You know, the era of jazz, flappers, and all that shiny nonsense. But tonight, we're not just talking about the glitter and the glam. Oh no. We're peeling back the golden veneer and stepping into the sticky underbelly of speakeasies, bootlegging, and crime. It's like the Gatsby party, but instead of champagne fountains, you'll be dodging corrupt cops and questionable bathtub gin. So before you sink into your bed like a flapper, sinking into a chaise lounge after 3 gin cocktails, take a second to like the video, subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here, and leave a comment with your favorite 1920s song, if you've got one. Go on. I won't judge if it's Charleston or the Benny Goodman Band. Now dim the lights, kick back, and make sure the imaginary Prohibition agents aren't lurking outside your window. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it would have been like to sneak into a speakeasy without getting caught? What was the secret knock? Did you have to pass through some shady alleyway where you had to dodge stray bullets and dubious characters who all smell like cigars? How exactly did they make that questionable bathtub gin? And speaking of which, would you have survived a night of gin-soaked debauchery, or would you have gotten arrested for being slightly too cheerful? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in 1925. You're in New York City, and you're about to experience a speakeasy the way they were meant to be. Illicit, loud, and probably dangerous. Hold on tight. Welcome to the Roaring Twenties, where the jazz was hot, the flappers were fierce, and everyone thought they were a little bit famous. But let's be honest, behind the glittering parties and shiny dresses, things weren't as glamorous as they seemed. In fact, it's almost like people thought being classy meant putting on a tuxedo over a whole bunch of bad decisions. You've got the shiny, sparkly exterior, the kind that makes people stop and stare at the spectacle. But what's really underneath that glitz and glamour? A bunch of folks in over-the-top outfits trying to convince everyone, including themselves, that they were living the dream. But in reality, they were more like a glittering house of cards, just waiting to fall apart. Take, for example, the extravagant parties. Jazz bands blaring, people in fancy clothes doing the Charleston like it's a workout. But behind the sequins and feathers, you've got half the crowd trying to figure out how to pay for their next meal or dodging the looming specter of prohibition laws. Oh, and don't forget about the bootleggers, who were basically the real MVPs of the 20s. They were out there risking everything for a bottle of booze, while everyone else pretended they were living their best life. The whole scene was like the world's most lavish game of pretend, with everyone playing their part in this larger-than-life production. But here's the kicker. They weren't just pretending to be fancy. They were pretending that the rules didn't apply to them. It's like the universe had pressed pause on reality, and for a brief, beautiful moment, they could pretend they were as untouchable as the rich characters in Gatsby's novel. But what's even funnier? The fact that people actually thought they were living the high life. The flappers, those daring women of the time, were strutting around in fringe dresses, cutting their hair into bobs, and tossing their morals into the wind. It looked like liberation, like women were finally free to do whatever they wanted. But truth be told, they were still playing a dangerous game. It's like being handed the keys to a car, but told you can drive anywhere you want, except to the place where you're safe and legal. Sure, they had the freedom to dance and smoke and drink like nobody's business, but they also had to live in constant fear of getting arrested, or worse, being on the receiving end of an angry mobster's bad mood. And let's not forget about the men of the Roaring Twenties. The suits were sharp, the hats were snazzy, and the mustaches were something straight out of a 1920s Instagram influencer's fantasy. But for every man in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, there were probably 3 others who were just trying to stay one step ahead of the law or find their next drink. It's like they were living in a constant state of, is this real life or are we all just in a movie? They had the swagger, the confidence, and the style, but underneath it all, they were just as susceptible to the chaos of the time as anyone else. And then there were the speakeasies, those hidden little havens where people could finally get a drink and pretend the law didn't exist. The thing about speakeasies, though, is that they weren't exactly as secret as people like to think. Everyone knew about them, but getting in was another story. It was like trying to join an exclusive club, but instead of fancy handshakes and secret codes, you had to know who to bribe, where to knock, and how to avoid getting caught by the cops who were definitely looking the other way most of the time. You'd stand outside in your finest attire, wondering if tonight was the night you'd finally be caught, trying to drink away the stress of prohibition, and then, bam, someone would tap you on the shoulder, say password, and usher you inside. And once you were in, it was like a magical world where everyone was pretending to be part of the upper class, even though half the people in the room couldn't afford a decent meal if they weren't sneaking booze behind the scenes. And let's talk about alcohol, because let's face it, Prohibition might have made alcohol more glamorous, but it didn't make it any less dangerous. Bathtub gin wasn't just a cute little drink. It was a one-way ticket to a hangover so bad, you'd think you'd spent the night wrestling with a bear. But in the 20s, who cared? People would drink anything as long as it got the job done. The idea of drinking something that might be brewed in someone's bathtub sounds absurd now, but back then, it was considered just another way to break the rules in style. So was it all just smoke and mirrors? In many ways, yes. But that didn't stop people from living it up, at least until they couldn't. It's like the world was spinning on a record player, playing jazz, alcohol, and secrets in a never-ending loop. Everything looked perfect from the outside, but as soon as the needle skipped, the cracks started to show. The Roaring Twenties were one long party, but the hangover was inevitable. Now let's pause for a moment. Imagine you're walking into a speakeasy, feeling like you've got it all figured out. You've found your drink, and you're part of something bigger than yourself. But deep down, you know, this night could be your last. And so, you sip your drink, dance the Charleston one more time, and hope the next song doesn't bring the cops crashing through the door. You've probably heard the saying, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. Well, in the 20s, when life gave people prohibition, they made moonshine, lots and lots of it. And by lots, I mean every conceivable container was used to smuggle alcohol, coffee cans, bathtubs, even somehow hollowed out canes. Talk about taking your business trip a little too far. You could almost imagine someone looking around their kitchen and thinking, how can I make this more illegal? And then going to town on their finest crockpot, brewing up a batch of highly questionable liquor that was probably more effective as a cleaning solvent than a drink. But hey, it worked. At least until the inevitable hangovers and law enforcement ruined the party. And let's be clear, Prohibition wasn't just about sneaking alcohol into a fancy party. It was a full-on underground operation. It was like America's most elaborate game of hide-and-seek, where the prize wasn't just a bottle of gin, but the sweet satisfaction of breaking the law while wearing a tuxedo. Bootleggers, the people responsible for making and distributing the illegal hooch, had to get creative. You'd think that by the time they were hiding booze in fake floors, secret compartments in cars, and even inside hollowed-out canes, they would have just given up. But no, people got clever. And with that cleverness came an explosion of new ways to smuggle, distribute, and sneak alcohol around. Even grandmas weren't safe from the bootleggers' tactics. Seriously, if you were walking around with a cane in the 20s, it was probably best to assume someone was drinking from it. Speaking of drinking, have you ever wondered what alcohol actually tasted like during Prohibition? It probably wasn't the smoothest stuff ever. In fact, if you were lucky, it might have tasted like the watered-down mess people are still calling gin today. But let's be honest, it didn't matter. People were getting their drink on, and they didn't care if it was basically industrial cleaner with a dash of citrus. What mattered was the experience. It was about sneaking into a speakeasy, throwing your coat over your shoulder, pretending you were part of the cool crowd, and then getting plastered enough to forget that you were technically committing a crime. A crime that would have gotten you in major trouble if the cops actually showed up, which they were doing more and more frequently. But that's beside the point. Of course, the real issue was that Prohibition didn't stop anyone from drinking. Oh no, in fact, it made everyone even more determined to drink, just in secret. It turned the act of buying a bottle of whiskey into something nearly as exciting as an espionage mission. And the more people tried to shut it down, the more inventive and daring those who just wanted a drink became. Speakeasies, the hidden bars where alcohol flowed freely, became the new nightlife staple. And if you didn't know the right people or have the right secret knock, you were stuck drinking water or tea like some kind of peasant. But if you were in the know, well, then you had access to a world of hidden cocktails, where every sip felt like you were part of some sort of daring revolution. It wasn't all fun and games, though. With Prohibition came the rise of organized crime. The same people who were once known for fancy activities, like horse racing, now turned into some of the most notorious criminals in history. The mafia ran the show, and every deal had a price tag attached, one that might involve a few broken legs if someone didn't play by the rules. So while the people in the speakeasies were busy dancing to jazz and pretending like they were above the law, they were unknowingly supporting a criminal empire that was making millions on their good times. You could say it was the 1920s version of a subscription service, except instead of delivering your meal kits, they delivered alcohol and violence. And let's talk about the law enforcement side of things. You'd think that with all these people trying to avoid being caught, the cops would have been pretty good at their job, right? Nope. For every cop who tried to shut down a speakeasy, there were at least 3 others taking bribes or getting caught in a sticky situation of their own. The idea of policing alcohol became as laughable as trying to put out a fire with a garden hose. Every time the law thought they had a hold on the situation, someone else found a new way to sneak a barrel of whiskey into a hidden room. And instead of stopping the flow of illegal booze, they just made it more exciting. It was like a game of cat and mouse, but everyone knew the cat was blindfolded and the mouse was already on the way to the bar. But as we all know, nothing lasts forever. The very thing that made Prohibition so exciting, the sneaky thrill, the constant chase, the feeling of doing something forbidden, eventually wore off. The public grew tired of being told what they could and couldn't do. By the end of the 1920s, the government realized it couldn't fight the inevitable. People were going to drink, whether they liked it or not. And so, in 1933, Prohibition ended and alcohol was legal again. But just like that, the thrill was gone. And though the speakeasies and bootleggers disappeared, the rebellious spirit of the 1920s lived on. So the next time you're enjoying your favorite drink, just remember, it wasn't always this easy. There was a time when your cocktail came with a side of danger and an undercurrent of defiance that makes the worst Monday mornings seem tame in comparison. The Roaring Twenties, where every sip of gin was a chance to break the law, and where every jazz song felt like it might be the last one played before the cops showed up. Bootlegging wasn't just about sneaking booze into cities. Oh no, it was practically an art form. Imagine running a secret empire where your office is a speakeasy, your product is illegal, and your best customer is the local mayor, all while trying to dodge the authorities, like it's some kind of 1920s hide-and-seek game. You'd need all the stealth of a ninja, the creativity of an artist, and the nerve of a cat burglar. But hey, when the stakes are as high as dodging jail time or worse, it's probably best to think of it as a game where losing might just involve a one-way ticket to the hooskow. Or worse, a mobster's bad mood. Now let's talk logistics. Running a bootlegging operation wasn't as simple as driving to a warehouse, loading up a car, and driving away. Oh no, it was much more complex. First off, the booze itself was often homemade, meaning it wasn't just smuggled, it was produced in bathtubs, barns, or any other secluded location that offered both privacy and a good space for illegal activities. Bootleggers had to get creative. 1 minute, they were distilling alcohol, and the next, they were hiding it inside crates marked as apples or furniture. A clever trick to keep the feds off their scent. It wasn't just about selling a drink. It was about surviving in a world where doing something as simple as getting a drink could send you to prison for years. But running a bootlegging operation wasn't just about the booze. Oh no, it was about running an entire underground network. There were suppliers, distributors, and, of course, those very important protection fees you paid to make sure your shipments arrived safely. Forget about your usual delivery services. These guys had to use everything from secret tunnels to hidden compartments in cars to get the booze across town. It was like a game of moving chess pieces, but with far more danger and far less strategy. You had to be smart, but not too flashy. If you were too flashy, you might attract the wrong kind of attention. And who exactly were the customers? Well, let's just say the customer base was interesting. You've got your average Joe looking for a drink in a dark basement somewhere, sure, but then you've got the city's elite, politicians, businessmen, and maybe even a few cops. Imagine being the mayor of a city during Prohibition. You've got to enforce the law and be the face of decency, but in reality, you're probably the one most in need of a drink. And you're not getting it from a local tavern. Oh no, you're probably sneaking in through the back door of a speakeasy where your bootlegger friend is waiting with a bottle of the finest gin. You're not exactly setting a good example for the voters, but hey, who's gonna stop you? Not the people who should be keeping you in check, that's for sure. And the best part? It wasn't even about just surviving. It was about thriving. Bootleggers were making so much money that they could practically buy off anyone. Police officers, politicians, judges. It didn't matter. They had cash, and they were willing to use it to keep their empire running smoothly. It was like living in a game where the rules were made up as you went along. You could own the city one day, and the next, you'd be in handcuffs, or if you were lucky, you'd walk away with your pockets full and your reputation intact. But being a bootlegger wasn't just about the profits, it was about the lifestyle too, the power, the mystery, the secrecy. Imagine being a bootlegger in the 20s. You're not just running a business, you're running a network of people who trust you to deliver the goods. It's like being a mix of a business tycoon and a secret agent, all while trying to keep your hands clean, literally and figuratively. You've got to keep everyone happy, the people who supply the booze, the people who distribute it, and of course, the people who drink it. If one piece of the puzzle goes missing, the whole thing comes crashing down. And let's not forget the thrill. Every successful shipment, every happy customer, every time you dodge a raid, it all adds up to one thing. You're winning. You're getting away with it. For a brief moment, you are untouchable. You're part of an underground society where rules are optional, and the thrill of the chase is what keeps you coming back. It's like running a race where the finish line keeps moving, and maybe, just maybe, you'll win this time. In the end, bootlegging was more than just about making money or breaking the law. It was about creating a culture, a legacy. The bootleggers of the 20s didn't just disappear when Prohibition ended. They evolved, they adapted, and in many cases, they turned their skills into legitimate businesses. Some even became celebrities, their names etched into history like those of the gangsters they once worked alongside. In the end, it wasn't just about running from the law. It was about building an empire on the edge of danger and doing it all with a smile, a fedora, and a pocket full of cash. And as you sit back, sipping your drink of choice, maybe it's worth remembering. You're one step away from that rebellious underground world. Just kidding. Or am I? If you wanted a drink during Prohibition, you had to know a guy, or know a guy who knew a guy. That's how speakeasies worked. Secret places tucked away behind hidden doors, or disguised as legitimate businesses. But let's be real, the secret wasn't the door. It was how many people managed to convince themselves they weren't committing a crime by going there. Everyone knew what was going on, but somehow when it was your turn to step through that hidden entrance and into the dim light of a speakeasy, you could pretend like you weren't about to break the law. In fact, the only thing more absurd than sneaking into a speakeasy was the fact that people were doing it and somehow feeling morally superior about it. It was the ultimate don't ask, don't tell scenario. You had to act like you weren't risking jail time just to enjoy a glass of gin. And let's talk about how you got in, because it wasn't as simple as walking through the front door. Oh no, my friend. First, you had to know the password. It wasn't enough that you had to be able to trust the guy who invited you in. No, you had to pass a test. What was that test, you ask? Well, it varied. Sometimes it was a secret knock. Sometimes it was a whispered word. Sometimes it was a handshake that looked suspiciously like the one you'd give your grandma. And just when you thought you had it figured out, there would be a trapdoor or a false wall, making you feel like you were entering a James Bond movie. It was like an exclusive club, but with more danger and fewer cocktails that actually tasted good. But here's the funny part. While everyone was acting like this was some sort of ultra-exclusive club, everyone and their dogs was sneaking into these hidden bars. Your grandmother? She was probably in there, sipping something stronger than tea, whispering her secret password. The mayor? Yeah, he was probably 3 gin cocktails deep, trying to keep a straight face while passing out corruption to anyone who looked at him funny. And of course, you've got the business owners, the lawyers, the doctors. All of them were regulars at speakeasies because, let's face it, after a long day of pretending to be a pillar of society, who wouldn't want to pop into an illicit bar for a little drink? But no one was talking about it, because the second you spoke out loud about what you were doing, you might as well have put a target on your back. It was the worst kept secret, and somehow that made it even better. The fact that these places existed at all is a testament to the lengths people will go to just to get a drink. Imagine the whole nation was supposed to be dry, and yet people in every major city, and many smaller ones, were drinking more than ever. The black market had turned alcohol into the ultimate contraband, and every time someone walked into a speakeasy, it felt like they were not just breaking the rules, but sticking it to the man. So while they might have left the bar happily clutching their half-empty glass, there was always this little lingering feeling, like someone was watching. It wasn't a good feeling, but it sure made the whole experience feel a bit more exciting. And let's not forget the atmosphere of these speakeasies. If you could get past the secret knock and the coded password, the party was far from what you'd expect from an underground establishment. The jazz bands were lively, the mood was raucous, and the dim lighting made everyone feel just a little bit more glamorous. People weren't just trying to get drunk, they were trying to be part of something rebellious, something that made them feel like they were living life on the edge, even if they were drinking gin that tasted like industrial solvent mixed with cough syrup. And how about the bartenders? These folks were the real MVPs. They had to know how to mix a drink, sure, but they also had to keep their wits about them while dealing with people who might be a cop in disguise or an angry gangster who didn't get his drink in time. They were masters of deception, knowing which drinks to serve when the feds were in the house and which ones to pour when the coast was clear. Their skill wasn't just in the shaker, it was in knowing how to smile, keep a low profile, and avoid getting caught up in the drama of the night. It was a risky job, but someone had to do it, and those bartenders did it with style. Let's also take a moment to talk about the drinks themselves. We've all heard the stories of bathtub gin, and let's be real, it wasn't great. But the fact that people were willing to swallow questionable liquids just to get a little tipsy says a lot about the desperation to have a drink during those dry years. Imagine going into a speakeasy, and instead of your go-to whiskey or gin, you're handed something that tastes suspiciously like it was brewed in someone's garage. But hey, it got the job done, and that's what mattered. For all the jazz and dancing, the truth was, the drinks weren't the star of the show. They were the ticket to the show. The speakeasy scene wasn't just about drinks, jazz, or sneaking around the law. It was a symbol of defiance, a big middle finger to the government's attempt to control people's lives. And in that defiance, people found something more than just a drink. They found a sense of camaraderie, an unspoken understanding that everyone in the room was in on the same secret. And maybe that's what made it all worth it. The fact that for a little while, everyone felt like they were part of something bigger than themselves, even if it was illegal, dangerous, and only temporary. So the next time you sip on your cocktail, just remember, somewhere back in the day, there was a secret bar, a hidden door, and a room full of people just trying to have a good time without the government ruining it. Cheers to rebellion in a glass. The 20s were filled with jazz, glitter, and let's face it, awkward dance moves. You could spot a flapper from a mile away, all swishing and swaying in a way that looked like they might have just tripped over their own feet, but somehow turned it into art. It was a time when people didn't just want to hear music, they wanted to live inside it, and that meant dancing like no one was watching, even though everyone definitely was. The flapper girl, with her bobbed hair, fringed dress, and a cocktail in hand, was the epitome of the era. But let's be honest, her moves didn't always look as smooth as they sounded in the music. It was more like a controlled chaos, a combination of arms and legs flailing with confidence, and somehow it all made sense in the end. Jazz music wasn't just an auditory experience, it was a full-body experience. If you didn't leave the dance floor covered in sweat, had you even been dancing? The rhythm, the improvisation, the syncopated beats, everything about jazz made you feel like you were part of a living, breathing entity. And while the music was all about freedom and breaking rules, the dance moves were the physical embodiment of that freedom. But the truth was, most people didn't know what they were doing half the time. They were just following the beats, letting their feet move to the rhythms like they were possessed by the music. It wasn't about getting the steps right. It was about feeling the groove. If you were moving, you were doing it right. And honestly, that's probably why it worked. Because in the 20s, no one cared if you were a good dancer, just as long as you kept moving. Now let's talk about the Charleston. Ah, yes, the dance that defined the decade. It was fast, it was wild, and it looked like a cross between someone having a seizure and a toddler trying to run for the first time. Legs kicking, arms flailing, all while trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. It's hard to imagine a dance so ridiculously awkward becoming the height of fashion, but somehow it did. Flappers were practically doing the Charleston everywhere, at parties, at speakeasies, on street corners, you name it. And truth be told, it looked like a workout more than a social activity, which, let's face it, was probably one of the main reasons people kept doing it. After a few too many glasses of bathtub gin, all you wanted to do was kick your legs and twirl your way into oblivion. The faster you went, the more you felt like you were on top of the world. But was anyone really on top of the world, or were we all just pretending that we were? Either way, the Charleston was here to stay. And then there were the men. Ah, the men of the jazz age. They wore their suits as sharp as their dance moves, which, let's be honest, weren't always that sharp. You'd think they'd stick to the tried and true waltz or something dignified, but no, the men in the 20s got in on the action too, and you can bet they weren't doing the waltz. If they weren't learning the Charleston, which they somehow made look even more awkward than the women, they were doing something that involved a lot of spinning, stomping, and maybe even throwing in a few questionable hip gyrations just to throw off the crowd. But it wasn't just about being good at it. It was about having the confidence to stand there and say, yeah, I'm doing this, and I'm doing it well, even if I'm not. But while the dance floors were full of energy, the real magic was in how the music and dance captured the spirit of the time. Jazz was all about improvisation, about going off script, about feeling the moment and creating something new in it. People weren't just doing the same steps over and over again. They were interpreting the music, making it their own. The idea of perfect practiced movements was thrown out the window. It didn't matter if you were dancing in perfect unison with everyone else. What mattered was that you were alive in the moment, moving with the rhythm of a new era. Jazz music and dance were the embodiment of rebellion, of youthful energy, and of people saying enough to the old ways of doing things. And let's not forget the men and women in the back of the clubs. the ones who weren't brave enough to take the floor but were absolutely loving the chaos from the sidelines. They were probably sipping cocktails, tapping their feet to the beat, and pretending they were too cool for the spotlight. But even they knew, deep down, they wished they could dance like the rest of them, like it didn't matter that everyone was watching. The 1920s was about breaking free of the old restrictions, about having fun and being loud about it. Whether you were in the spotlight or clinging to the edge of the dance floor, you were part of something bigger. So the next time you hear a jazz tune or see someone doing the Charleston in a movie, remember, it wasn't just a dance. It was a declaration of freedom. And for the people of the jazz age, freedom was something worth dancing for, even if the steps didn't always make sense. The 1920s weren't just about living the high life. They were about dancing like there was no tomorrow, even if that dance sometimes made you look like you'd been kicked by a horse. But hey, at least you were doing it with style. You might think bathtub gin sounds like something that came straight out of a mad scientist's lab, and you'd be absolutely right. It was often made in unsanitary conditions, with ingredients that could knock you out faster than a 2-for-1 deal at your local bar. Picture it: a cramped, dimly lit basement, a few shady individuals gathered around, carefully mixing up what they hoped would pass for alcohol. The whole process was part chemistry experiment, part game of let's see if this kills us. And the best part? It was often served in glassware so dirty, it could have doubled as a petri dish for cultivating new bacteria. But hey, who cares about germs when you're getting a buzz, right? The ingredients for bathtub gin were about as questionable as the places it was made. The base? Well, it could have been anything from industrial alcohol, the kind that's used to fuel machines, not your party, to straight-up rubbing alcohol. This wasn't your top-shelf, artisanal gin you'd get at a fancy bar. It was something much more sinister. In fact, if you were lucky, the gin you were drinking might have had some actual botanicals in it, like juniper berries. But most of the time, you were just drinking something that smelled like cleaning products. But hey, it's Prohibition, and people were desperate enough to overlook the fact that this gin might have been more toxic than the fumes from a gas leak. Now the best part, the bathtub. Yes, that's right. Bathtub gin wasn't just made anywhere. It was often brewed in bathtubs. The process itself wasn't quite as refined as the distillation methods of, say, a fancy gin distillery in London. Oh no, this was more of a throw everything in a tub, cross your fingers, and hope for the best situation. In some cases, the alcohol was mixed with things like yeast, sugar, and if you were lucky, a little bit of flavoring to make it drinkable. If you weren't so lucky, you were left with something that resembled firewater mixed with an industrial solvent, basically a cocktail that could double as paint thinner. But people were still drinking it because, well, Prohibition. What other choice did they have? It wasn't like you could waltz down to the corner liquor store and grab a bottle of something safe and familiar. No, you had to roll the dice on whatever the underground distillers were cooking up in their bathtubs. The actual brewing process was a delicate balance between hope and despair. You had to get the mixture just right, but that was often easier said than done. If you didn't know what you were doing, or worse, if your moonshiner didn't, then you could end up with something downright lethal. One of the key ingredients in bathtub gin was wood alcohol, which when consumed in large quantities could cause blindness or death. But don't worry, the makers of bathtub gin were experts in the art of deception. They would cut the alcohol with cheaper ingredients, like grain alcohol, sugar, or even artificial flavorings to try to mask the terrible taste. And yet, despite all the risks, both to your health and your dignity, people were lining up for it. Because, as we all know, when you're told you can't have something, that's exactly when you want it the most. And nothing screamed rebellion like a glass of illegal gin. Once you managed to find this questionable concoction, the next challenge was the taste. Imagine the harshest, most bitter alcohol you've ever had, multiplied by 10 with a lingering aftertaste that would stick with you for days. And yet, somehow, this was the drink of choice for many people during Prohibition. It wasn't about enjoying a finely crafted cocktail. It was about surviving the era and joining the underground rebellion. And if your liver protested, well, that was just part of the price you paid for your moment of lawless joy. But even as people were drinking this incredibly risky substance, the social scene around it was still thriving. The speakeasies were buzzing with activity, swing dancing, jazz bands, and people desperately trying to maintain the appearance that they were having the time of their lives while sipping on what could have easily been described as liquid regret. But for many, it was worth it. The thrill of sneaking into a hidden bar, whispering the secret password, and then sipping on whatever poorly made hooch was available made them feel like they were part of something special. A little bit rebellious, a little bit dangerous, but undeniably fun. They were living on the edge, even if they had no idea how much damage they were doing to their bodies with every sip of bathtub gin. So let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer absurdity of it all. People were literally risking their lives to get drunk. And not just any kind of drunkenness, the kind that was probably giving you a headache before you even finished your drink. But in the face of Prohibition, it was the only choice. You couldn't exactly pop into a bar, have a nice cocktail, and enjoy the night. No, you had to work for it. You had to seek out the secret spots, dodge the cops, and pray that the booze you were drinking wasn't going to send you to the hospital the next morning. And in the grand scheme of things, wasn't that just a little bit charming, a little bit dangerous, maybe a little bit stupid, but all in the name of rebellion and a good time? So next time you enjoy your perfectly mixed gin and tonic, raise a glass to the past, where people risked their health and their freedom just to have a little fun in a world gone mad. Cheers to bathtub gin, the drink that could kill you, but probably won't. Behind every great speakeasy, there's a mobster, probably wearing a fedora and looking like he's about to take you for a ride, literally. The world of organized crime during the 1920s was a strange, dangerous, and oddly charming place where you had to be as slick as the whiskey you were peddling. The mobsters of this time were not just criminals, they were entrepreneurs, visionaries in their own right, and somehow, despite everything, they became legends. With their sharp suits, smooth talk, and unwavering confidence, they were the very backbone of the speakeasy scene. Without them, those hidden bars full of illicit liquor would have never been more than just a few dimly lit basements. The mobsters weren't just running the show, they were the show. Let's set the scene. You've just been led through a secret door into a speakeasy. The jazz band is playing, the dance floor is alive with flappers doing the Charleston, and everyone is having a great time. But then you see him, the guy in the corner, standing a little too still, eyeing everyone in the room. He's wearing a fedora, a crisp suit, and his shoes look like they've been polished to perfection. He's got a cigar in one hand and a drink in the other, But you don't miss the way his hand rests casually on the edge of his pocket, just inches away from his pistol. This guy isn't just a partygoer. He's part of the machinery that makes this whole operation run. You're not there because you know the right people. You're there because he's letting you be there. You might think of these gangsters as the bad guys of the era, and you wouldn't be wrong. But the truth is, they were also the ones making the whole speakeasy scene possible. They were the ones risking their necks to get booze into the city, providing people with a taste of rebellion and fun while the law tried to shut everything down. These guys were the definition of business as usual, except their business was the kind that got you a one-way ticket to jail if the cops showed up. But the beauty of it was, they didn't care. As far as they were concerned, running alcohol was just another day at the office. The only difference? Their office was a bar, their clients were the elite, and their competitors were the law. Let's talk about the unsung part of the gangster story. If you were a mobster in the 1920s, you weren't just out there robbing banks and running illegal liquor. You were also in charge of logistics. You had to make sure your alcohol was distilled, packaged, and delivered without getting caught. This wasn't just about moving booze. It was about creating a network of supply and demand that spanned entire cities. A shipment of gin didn't just arrive at its destination. It had to be carefully routed through back alleys, hidden compartments in cars, and even underground tunnels to avoid the authorities. It was like running a secret empire, one where everything was hush-hush, and trust was the only currency that mattered. But this wasn't just about moving products. It was about managing a team of people who could keep their mouths shut and handle business when things went south. The stakes were high, and the consequences even higher. If you messed up, you didn't just lose a shipment, you could lose your life. The mobster's life wasn't just dangerous, it was a never-ending game of survival. And then there's the charm. Yes, even in a world that was soaked in corruption, violence, and constant risk, there was a level of allure to being a mobster in the 20s. It wasn't just the suits or the power, it was the lifestyle. Mobsters were celebrities in their own right. They walked into a room and instantly became the center of attention. People wanted to be around them, wanted to hear their stories, wanted to be part of the action. You weren't just buying alcohol from a mobster. You were buying into a world that felt exciting, dangerous, and just a little bit glamorous. It was like being in on a secret that the rest of society wasn't privy to. The problem was that secret didn't always stay secret for long. Mobsters lived fast and hard, and their lives often ended just as abruptly as they began. But for a moment, they were untouchable, kings of their own world. Let's not forget the role of mobsters in the real economy of the 1920s. While everyone else was scrambling to deal with the fallout of Prohibition, the mobsters were cashing in. They were the ones supplying the demand for alcohol, running numbers games, and doing business in ways that kept the economy running under the radar. They weren't just criminals, they were underground entrepreneurs, and like any business, they were ruthless about their competition. Rivalries between mobs could get as heated as any corporate battle today, with the added danger of violence lurking just around the corner. But it wasn't all shootouts and car chases. A good mobster knew when to lay low and when to strike, which was why some of them managed to live long enough to enjoy the spoils of their illegal empires. In the end, while we often remember the speakeasy scene for its jazz, its flappers, and its clandestine bars, we can't forget the mobsters who made it all happen. They were the unsung heroes, the ones who turned every glass of gin into a thrilling act of rebellion. Without them, there would have been no speakeasies, no jazz-fueled nights of illegal fun. The mobsters were the true architects of the 20s underground, and while we might look back with a certain amount of romanticism, let's not forget, for every glamorous cocktail party, there was a mobster somewhere pulling the strings behind the scenes. Imagine being a federal agent during Prohibition, just waiting for the day you can bust open the next speakeasy and ruin everyone's fun. For them, it was all about catching the bad guys. And by bad guys, I mean people who were really, really good at throwing parties. These agents were the original party poopers, walking into dimly lit clubs, stopping the music, and ending the night just as the jazz band was hitting its stride. They didn't care about the 1920s glamour or the wild fashion. The only thing they cared about was enforcing the law. And let's be real, they were probably about as popular as a leaky umbrella in a rainstorm. You see, the job of a Prohibition agent wasn't just about busting people for drinking illegal alcohol. It was about preventing people from having any fun at all. Think about it. These guys had the thankless job of showing up at a perfectly good party, throwing a wrench into everything, and then walking away like they'd just won a prize. No jazz, no cocktails, just a bunch of people who had to scatter in every direction to avoid getting arrested. The worst part? For every agent who was doing their duty, there were 3 more trying to figure out how to sneak in and enjoy the drinks without being caught. For the feds, it was a game of cat and mouse, but the problem was, they were the mouse and everyone else was the cat. Now let's talk about the tactics of these agents. If you're picturing a bunch of stiff-suited, bookish folks nervously walking into a bar with a badge, you're only half right. Sure, there were some of those, but the real Prohibition agents were masters of undercover operations. They were the first to put the spy in sneaky. They would go undercover as customers, blending in with the crowd, sipping whatever questionable concoction the bartender served, all while keeping an eagle eye on who was doing what. It's not like they could just walk into a bar and demand a drink. No, they had to pretend to be just another regular patron. The only difference was, while everyone else was enjoying their glass of gin, they were carefully noting who was ordering what, and more importantly, who was giving them the nod that indicated they were part of the illicit operation. These agents had to be as slippery as the criminals they were chasing, only their brand of slipperiness didn't come with a fun jazz tune to accompany it. And let's not forget about the methods they used. When the agents weren't blending into the crowd, they were working with the resources of a full-scale police operation, going after mobsters, bootleggers, and anyone who was daring enough to throw a party with a speakeasy at the center of it. And oh, did the speakeasies get creative? Hidden doors, false walls, secret knock codes, everything a Fed's worst nightmare. Yet no matter how clever the operation, the agents were always a step behind. It's almost as if the speakeasy owners were competing in their own version of how to outsmart the cops. Some speakeasies had more back doors than a haunted mansion, and you could bet that the second the feds tried to crash a party, half the patrons would disappear through some hidden exit, leaving the agents with nothing but an empty room and a bunch of, "I swear I wasn't doing anything" looks. But let's be honest, even the feds had their moments of desperation. At the height of Prohibition, the pressure to actually catch someone became so intense that agents would sometimes take desperate measures, like the time they would raid a speakeasy, hoping for a big bust, only to find out the booze was long gone and everyone had left it hours ago. You'd have to imagine how disappointing that must have been. All that build-up, all that tension, only to find out you'd just missed a party. It was like trying to stop a flood with a paper towel. You could barely make a dent, but you had to try, because your paycheck depended on it. And as much as they wanted to be seen as the moral heroes, some agents couldn't help but feel a bit of envy as they watched everyone else have a blast. Here they were, sneaking into back rooms, dodging booze and jazz, while everyone else was dancing and drinking illegally without a care in the world. And let's face it, no one's ever felt truly heroic while forcing a bunch of tipsy flappers to go home early. The truth is, these agents didn't just ruin parties, they killed the vibe. They made the jazz sound less jazzy, the drinks taste less intoxicating, and the overall feeling less rebellious. But despite all the good intentions, Prohibition really became a game of trying to enforce the unenforceable. The feds may have been out there doing their job, but in the end, they couldn't stop the inevitable. People were going to party. They were going to drink. They were going to have fun, even if they had to sneak around in the shadows to do it. For every agent busting in to ruin someone's night, there were 5 more just waiting to get in on the action. And while the feds were trying to keep it all under control, the reality was clear. Prohibition had turned fun into an underground sport, and for some, that made it even more exciting. After all, what's a good party without a little danger? While everyone was busy hiding behind closed doors, sipping illegal drinks, someone else was footing the bill. Prohibition didn't just hurt the government's bottom line, it created a criminal underworld that would take years to dismantle, and the poor folks who were just trying to have a drink were the ones getting caught in the crossfire. On the surface, Prohibition seemed like a noble attempt to clean up society, but in reality, it was a moralistic band-aid that ignored the real issue at hand. While the rich could sneak into hidden speakeasies, the everyday citizen found themselves squeezed by a law that only seemed to benefit the criminal element. The true cost of Prohibition wasn't just economic, it was social, political, and deeply human. For one, it fueled the growth of organized crime like never before. Bootleggers, gangsters, and mobsters began to rule the streets, filling the power vacuum left by the government's inability to enforce the law effectively. People who were once harmless alcohol sellers turned into full-blown criminals, making deals behind closed doors, shaking down businesses, and sometimes even engaging in full-blown shootouts to protect their turf. The only thing prohibited about Prohibition was the legal purchase of alcohol. The demand didn't go anywhere, and those who were desperate enough to drink in secret paid the price in more ways than one. Let's take a look at the real consequences for the people who had no choice but to break the law just to enjoy a glass of gin. For the average citizen, getting caught drinking or distributing alcohol was a one-way ticket to a fine, arrest, or worse, jail time. The middle class, those who were just trying to unwind after a long day, found themselves suddenly at odds with the law in a way they had never experienced before. A whole new class of petty criminals emerged, people who weren't mobsters or bootleggers, but regular folks who got caught at the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong drink. Imagine being a working-class family trying to scrape by and finding that your quiet night out had turned into a criminal investigation just because you wanted to enjoy a beer or a whiskey. These were the same folks who were already struggling under the weight of the Great Depression, and Prohibition just made their lives that much harder. But beyond the arrests, the real cost was the toll it took on society's sense of justice. During Prohibition, the lines between good and bad became increasingly blurred. You had the feds, supposedly fighting for the moral high ground, while the criminals they pursued were the ones offering a level of fun and rebellion that people craved. And who were the real victims of this moral crusade? Not the gangsters or the rich men who could afford to bribe their way out of trouble, but the average, everyday citizens who were simply looking for an escape. In trying to create a better society, Prohibition created a more corrupt one, a society where the government, rather than putting an end to crime, was indirectly fueling it. And then there's the effect it had on public safety. Since alcohol was still in demand, people turned to the underground market to meet that demand, buying whatever they could find, often with no real knowledge of what they were consuming. And that's when things got ugly. Bathtub gin, moonshine, and other bootlegged alcohol often contained harmful, sometimes lethal ingredients. The government may have made alcohol illegal, but it did nothing to ensure the safety of those consuming it. People were drinking something that had the potential to blind them, poison them, or kill them. But as long as it was illegal, people were willing to take that risk. The government, in its effort to stop alcohol consumption, had inadvertently created a new black market for dangerous, low-quality alcohol. And once again, it was the people, regular, everyday people, who paid the price. The economic consequences were no less disastrous. The loss of alcohol taxes meant the government was suddenly facing a huge hole in its budget. With bootleggers running rampant, the IRS struggled to track the immense flow of illegal money, and businesses that had once thrived on alcohol sales saw their income disappear overnight. The state governments were left scrambling to figure out how to make up for the loss, and, ironically, the very law that was supposed to protect the public was instead creating more problems than it was solving. On the flip side, the bootleggers were making bank. By the time Prohibition ended, they had cemented themselves as some of the wealthiest and most powerful figures in the country. The real irony? They were the ones who benefited from a law that was supposed to end their lucrative business. Proof, if there ever was one, that a good idea can go horribly wrong when it's poorly executed. In the end, the real cost of Prohibition wasn't just in the broken lives, the tarnished reputations, and the wrecked public trust. It was in the way it fundamentally changed how Americans saw themselves and their government. It turned people who just wanted a drink into criminals. It lined the pockets of the mobsters, and it left the rest of the population to deal with the fallout. Prohibition didn't just stop people from drinking, it changed the very fabric of American society, making it more fractured, more corrupt, and more chaotic than it had ever been before. And the people who paid the most? The ones who were just trying to have a good time. So next time you raise a glass to freedom, just remember that it came with a price, and sometimes that price wasn't paid by the ones you'd expect. Flappers were the true rebels of the 1920s. They wore short skirts, smoked cigarettes, and danced like nobody was watching. Because let's face it, in a world where men wore hats indoors, they probably weren't paying attention anyway. These women weren't just pushing boundaries, they were throwing them out the window. In a time when women were still expected to be demure, soft-spoken, and let's be honest, kind of boring, the Flappers turned all that on its head. They were the epitome of everything society feared: confident, independent, and more than willing to shake up the status quo just to get a reaction. And boy, did they get reactions. First, let's talk about those skirts. The flappers didn't just wear shorter skirts, they practically invented the idea of the scandalous hemline. Up until then, women's fashion had been all about modesty. Dresses were long, waistlines were high, and the most scandalous thing about a woman's outfit was whether or not she wore a little ankle-high boot. Enter the flapper with her knee-length dress and her "don't tell me what to wear" attitude. It wasn't just about showing a little leg, it was about making a statement. The flappers were saying, "Hey, I'm here and I'm not afraid to show it." This wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a protest in fabric form. But of course, it wasn't just the clothing that made these women stand out. Oh no, it was the attitude. The flappers didn't just walk into a room, they owned it. Imagine walking into a smoky jazz club in the middle of the 1920s, surrounded by men in suits who still thought it was cool to wear a top hat at the dinner table. And there you are, a flapper, with your bobbed hair and daring smile, ready to knock everyone's socks off with your Charleston moves. You didn't care if you were underdressed or overexposed by society's standards. You were too busy dancing your heart out and demanding attention because you knew yous were worth it. The most shocking part of the flapper rebellion was the smoking. Women smoking in public? How scandalous. It wasn't just a pastime, it was an act of defiance. In a world where women were still expected to be delicate, fragile creatures, puffing away on a cigarette was a way to say, "I am not your delicate flower." Cigarettes became symbols of the flapper's independence, her desire to be treated as an equal, not some porcelain doll on display. She wasn't just sipping tea with the ladies, she was lighting up, laughing, and holding her own in a conversation that didn't need to be polite or proper. Let's not forget about the dancing. The flapper wasn't just content to sit idly by while the men tangoed their way through life. No, she was out on the dance floor, doing the Charleston, the black bottom, and any other dance that involved shaking, wiggling, and generally disregarding any sense of propriety. And while men might have been stifling their giggles, behind their newspapers, the flappers were spinning, twirling, and doing the electric slide, well, sort of. For these women, dance wasn't just a social event, it was freedom. It was a chance to express themselves in a world that was more comfortable watching women sit still and be seen, not heard. But it wasn't all fun and games for the flappers. As much as they were celebrated for their boldness and energy, they were also the target of scorn. The older generations looked down on them as wild, unrefined, and frankly, a little too much to handle. To many, they were a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world. Women were supposed to be graceful, soft-spoken, and above all, modest. Flappers were none of those things. They were loud, they were brash, and they made sure the world noticed. They weren't just breaking rules, they were rewriting them entirely. But in doing so, they ignited a new era of women's rights, self-expression, and freedom. The flappers may have been controversial, but they were also revolutionary. They were a direct challenge to the norm, and their boldness had a lasting impact on how women were perceived. It wasn't just about dancing in short skirts. It was about claiming your space in a world that wasn't ready for you to be so free. The flappers didn't just want equality. They wanted to live life on their own terms. They wanted to be seen, heard, and most importantly, respected as equals. They weren't waiting for permission. They were out there making it happen, and anyone who didn't like it could take a seat. In the end, The flappers weren't just a symbol of the jazz age. They were the heartbeat of it. They were the ones pushing society to the brink, showing that being a woman didn't mean being quiet and obedient. They proved that freedom, in all its messy, wonderful glory, was for everyone. And they did it all with a cigarette in one hand, a drink in the other, and a carefree attitude that still has us talking about them nearly a century later. If you thought fighting over the last bottle of wine at your local grocery store was tough, imagine being in the 20s when whiskey was worth more than your firstborn child. People weren't just fighting for booze, they were fighting for survival in a time when a bottle could cost you an arm and a leg, literally. And when I say literally, I'm not joking. Prohibition had turned whiskey into more than just a drink. It became a prized commodity, the black market's golden ticket. If you were lucky enough to score a bottle, you were considered something of a hero. But let's be real, most people weren't lucky, and those who were, well, they weren't sharing. So what did it take to get your hands on whiskey in 1922? It was like trying to find a needle in a haystack, except the needle was filled with the good stuff, and the haystack was crawling with government agents, organized crime, and other folks who were willing to sell their soul for a sip of that sweet, illegal liquor. Imagine this. You're a regular guy just trying to get a drink to unwind after a long day. You know the drill. Head to a speakeasy, flash the secret knock, and order your drink like it's no big deal. But oh no, not in 1922. The demand for whiskey had skyrocketed to the point where even the speakeasy owners were sweating. Prices were being driven up, and not just by a little bit. A bottle that would have cost you a few bucks in 1919 was now being sold for 10 times the price, and sometimes even more. This wasn't just inflation. This was desperation. You had to be crafty to even know where to look. A speakeasy wasn't just a bar. It was an entire underground network. And the folks running them were usually only too happy to tell you that they had whiskey, if you knew the right people. So here's the game. First, you'd have to find a speakeasy in the first place, which meant getting through a maze of alleyways, hidden entrances, and maybe even secret codes that felt more like trying to crack an ancient language than getting a drink. Once you managed to find it, you'd enter into a room full of folks who were all there for one thing: whiskey. And if you didn't get there early enough, well, you'd be stuck drinking something that barely resembled what you wanted. But hey, a drink was a drink, right? The problem, of course, wasn't just getting in, it was what you were willing to pay. Bootleggers, the true entrepreneurs of Prohibition, were in control of the whiskey trade, and they weren't afraid to take advantage of people's thirst. Whiskey was being smuggled from who knows where, and by the time it hit the black market, it was more valuable than diamonds. And let's be clear, when you're paying that much for something, you really want it to be good. But more often than not, the whiskey you got was far from the fine, aged liquor you might expect. Instead, it was often made with questionable ingredients and cut with things that made your stomach churn. But when you're dealing with a shortage of whiskey that could send you to jail or worse, you'd probably drink it anyway because, well, what else could you do? The real kicker in all of this? The government. They thought they could shut down the whiskey trade by making it illegal. But all they did was create a new class of millionaire criminals and turn the whiskey trade into an even bigger underground operation. The more they cracked down on bootleggers, the more inventive the smugglers got. You had whiskey being delivered in everything from hollowed-out cars to fake shipments of household goods. And as if that wasn't enough, the feds were always a step behind. It wasn't just a problem of getting alcohol, it was a problem of survival for the government agents trying to stop it. But let's pause for a second and think about the real victims of the whiskey shortage. It wasn't just the folks who had to pay outrageous prices for a bottle. It was the average law-abiding citizens who had no access to the black market. Imagine being an upstanding citizen, a person who wasn't involved in any of this underground activity, but who just wanted a nice, relaxing drink after a stressful week. You'd think you could just waltz into a bar, pay a fair price, and get what you needed. But no, those days were gone. If you were lucky, you might get a watered-down drink, but more often than not, you'd be stuck with something that didn't even resemble the whiskey you used to enjoy. And if you got caught, you were looking at jail time. So in the end, it was the regular folks, the ones who weren't involved in crime, who suffered the most. And then there were the smugglers themselves. These weren't just shadowy figures in the night. They were often normal people trying to make a living in the most ridiculous way possible. Imagine the stress of being a bootlegger. You're driving through dark alleys, avoiding the cops, and praying that your shipment doesn't get caught up in some random raid. You're not just risking your business, you're risking your life. But when the stakes are high, the rewards are too, and the profits were rolling in. But at what cost? For every smuggler's success, there were countless busts, ruined careers, and a general sense of lawlessness that took over the country. In the end, the Great Whiskey Shortage wasn't just a story of alcohol and crime. It was a story about the failure of a well-intentioned law that didn't just ruin the fun for people. It broke down trust in the system. People weren't just fighting for whiskey. They were fighting for a sense of normalcy in a world turned upside down by Prohibition. And when they couldn't find it on the shelves, they went looking for it wherever they could. But the price they paid, that would echo throughout history. It wasn't a proper party unless there was a jazz band playing. The musicians were the true life of the party, creating tunes that made people forget their troubles, their taxes, and most of all, the fact that they were probably committing a felony by just being there. Jazz was the rhythm of rebellion, the soundtrack to an era of excitement and defiance. And those bands, they weren't just playing instruments. They were conducting the whole scene, setting the tone, and keeping everyone moving to the beat of freedom. If you wanted a good time in the Roaring '20s, you needed two things: a speakeasy and a jazz band that could make you forget you were breaking the law. But jazz wasn't just the music of the night. It was a revolution in itself. Before the '20s, music was all about structure, formality, and properness. But jazz was about chaos. It was an explosion of sound, a mix of rhythms, improvisation, and a sense that in that moment anything was possible. And who better to lead this musical charge than a jazz band? These weren't your typical orchestras playing from a sheet of music. They were groups of musicians who were constantly creating something new, something fresh, with every song. It wasn't just a performance, it was a conversation. The musicians played off each other, trading solos, riffing, and bending the rules of music to create an experience that could never be replicated. You couldn't find that kind of freedom in your average ballroom orchestra. The jazz band was like a wild animal unleashed on the world, unpredictable, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. For the people at the speakeasies, jazz was everything. Sure, you could drink illegally and hide behind secret doors, but the true magic happened when the music started. There was a certain electricity in the air, a feeling that the moment was special. Everyone knew they were part of something forbidden, but the music made it feel like it was all okay. As the horns blared and the piano keys rang out, people danced as if they didn't have a care in the world, spinning, twisting, and kicking in ways that defied logic, and most likely gravity. The Charleston wasn't just a dance, it was an invitation to let go, to step into a world where time and rules didn't matter, and the jazz bands were the ones who held the key to that world. Without them, it wouldn't have been a party. It would have just been a bunch of people awkwardly standing around, sipping bad gin, and trying to avoid eye contact with the cops. But let's talk about the musicians themselves. These guys weren't just playing tunes. They were setting the pace of the entire evening. Imagine being a saxophonist or a trumpeter in a jazz band during Prohibition. You were the heartbeat of the speakeasy. Every time your instrument hit that sweet note, the crowd responded with cheers, dances, and laughs. You could feel the energy in the room shift with every solo, every melody. Jazz musicians were the ultimate entertainers, but they were also the ultimate rebels. In a time when society was trying to clamp down on every form of fun, they were out there doing what they did best, creating chaos with their music. They were playing the soundtrack to the rebellion, encouraging everyone to let loose, even if the whole thing might come crashing down at any moment. But that was the point. Jazz wasn't just about the music. It was about the attitude, the thrill of doing something bold, and the rush of living life on the edge. Of course, being a jazz musician during Prohibition wasn't all fun and games. You had to deal with more than just drunk people trying to dance and sing along out of tune. You had to keep an ear out for the cops too. While you were playing, you had to stay alert for any signs that the party was about to be shut down. Speakeasy owners were constantly looking over their shoulders, and the musicians had to be just as cautious. If the feds came busting through this door, the music had to stop in a split second, and the whole band had to pack up and hide their instruments faster than a cat trying to escape a dog. But it wasn't always that dramatic. Sometimes it was just about being on the run, constantly moving from one club to the next, trying to find a place where the music could keep flowing without interruption. But the risk wasn't just part of the job. It was the fuel that made the music even more exciting. Jazz was about freedom, and the musicians who played it knew that every gig could be their last if the wrong person showed up. And that danger, that unpredictability, seeped into every note they played. It wasn't just the speed of the rhythm that got your heart racing. It was the knowledge that at any moment, everything could come to an abrupt end. But for those few hours, it didn't matter. The jazz band kept playing, and the world outside could wait. The party continued, even as the world around it tried to put it out. As the decade wore on and Prohibition finally came to an end, the jazz bands of the 20s had already left their mark. The music they created didn't just define the era, it transformed the way we think about music itself. The freedom, the improvisation, the rebellion, all of it was woven into the jazz that defined the decade. The speakeasies might have closed their doors, but the sound of the jazz bands echoed long after the last bottle was hidden. It wasn't just the drink that kept people coming back. It was the rhythm, the beat, and the feeling that for a brief moment in time, they were part of something bigger than themselves. And that, my friend, is what made those jazz bands the real party planners of the 20s. It wasn't just the gangsters who made money off of Prohibition. There was a whole economy built around illegal alcohol. From the people making the alcohol to those distributing it, Prohibition made millionaires out of people who knew how to bend the law. The government may have thought they were putting a stop to the fun, but what they really did was create one of the most lucrative underground industries the world had ever seen. And let's be real, this wasn't just about crime. This was about people seizing an opportunity to turn a profit from the law's failure to control what the public wanted most: booze. At the top of the Prohibition money-making pyramid were the bootleggers, the people who ran the show and brought in the big bucks. You might think of them as gangsters or criminals, but in reality they were business people, ruthless, inventive, and incredibly savvy business people. They didn't just smuggle alcohol, they created an entire distribution network that stretched from coast to coast. They had to be creative, constantly dodging the authorities, using everything from hidden compartments in cars to fake crates labeled with things like apples or furniture. If you could think it up, someone was probably already doing it. Prohibition, for all its attempts to curb drinking, created a massive underground market, and if you were clever enough to figure out how to navigate it, you were looking at some serious cash. And then there were the people making the alcohol itself, the moonshiners, often working in secret distilleries, hidden deep in the woods or in barns far from prying eyes. They were the unsung heroes, or villains, depending on how you see it, of Prohibition's alcohol industry. You could call them the craftsmen of crime. The thing is, they weren't just brewing up whatever random chemicals they could find. They had to be good at it. Producing alcohol that was both strong enough to get people drunk and drinkable enough to not immediately put you in the hospital was an art form. Moonshiners were working with makeshift equipment, using whatever tools they had on hand to distill their product. And when they succeeded, they could sell that alcohol for a fortune. In fact, the quality of moonshine was often better than you'd think. While some batches were, of course, toxic and made people sick, the best moonshiners knew how to make their products smooth enough to pass for something you'd buy at a legitimate bar. And that, right there, was the gold mine. High-quality moonshine that could be sold at a premium, often to the same people who were too rich to care where it came from. Politicians, businessmen, and even law enforcement officers. These were the kinds of people willing to fork over top dollar for a bottle of illegal booze. It didn't matter that it was dangerous or unlawful. If the quality was right, they were all in. Of course, if you're running a bootlegging operation, you need more than just the product. You need a network of distributors to get it out to the people. This is where the real money started rolling in. Distributors worked in the shadows, making sure the whiskey made it into the speakeasies and underground bars that dotted the country. These were the middlemen, the ones who knew how to keep a low profile, blend in with the crowd, and avoid the watchful eyes of the authorities. They weren't the ones getting their hands dirty in the distilling process, but they were just as crucial to the operation. They were paid handsomely for their discretion, making a tidy profit for every bottle they moved. And like any good business person, they were always looking for ways to expand their reach, constantly pushing into new territories and finding new ways to outsmart the cops. But don't think for a second that the government wasn't getting its slice of the pie. While Prohibition may have been intended to cut down on the consumption of alcohol, the reality was that it created an entire economy of bribery and corruption. The authorities tasked with enforcing Prohibition were often on the take, turning a blind eye in exchange for cash. You had law enforcement officers, judges, and even politicians making deals with bootleggers and gangsters. And while the government was raking in fines and busting a few low-level offenders here and there, they were missing the real players, the ones making millions off of illegal alcohol. The government was getting paid, sure, But they were getting played, too. The bigger the operation, the more money they had to keep the feds at bay. And so, a corrupt system was born, one where the rich got richer, and the law had little chance of keeping up. As the illegal alcohol business grew, so did the infrastructure around it. You had people setting up hidden bars, secret clubs, and underground distilleries, creating a whole subculture that operated outside the law. But as much as it was a thriving underground economy, it was also a dangerous one. Rival bootleggers didn't just compete for customers, they competed for territory. They fought viciously to control the flow of alcohol into different areas, leading to violent confrontations, shootouts, and turf wars. It wasn't just about who could make the best booze. It was about who could make the most money, and sometimes that meant resorting to tactics that made the mafia look like amateurs. The real irony of it all? While Prohibition was supposed to stop drinking, it only made people more creative and more determined to get their hands on alcohol. And as for the government, they couldn't have been more out of touch. Prohibition didn't just create millionaires, it created a booming black market that was impossible to suppress, no matter how many laws they passed. So in the end, who was really profiting from Prohibition? It wasn't the people who had the good intentions. It was the ones who knew how to turn the law into a moneymaker, and the rest of the country? They were stuck in the middle, getting caught between the gangsters, the feds, and the ever-growing demand for a drink. Let's face it, people love a good underground movement. And during the 1920s, speakeasies were as cool as anything could get. People didn't just want to go to these secret bars because of the booze. They wanted to be part of something that felt rebellious, like a secret club for those who knew how to break the rules in style. There was something undeniably thrilling about the idea of sneaking in through a hidden door, knowing that the world outside was still obeying laws that seemed so boring. Inside those dimly lit rooms, away from the prying eyes of the authorities, you could be whoever you wanted. You weren't just drinking illegally. You were living on the edge, sticking it to the man, and doing it all while dancing to jazz. It wasn't just about the alcohol, it was about the atmosphere, the thrill of doing something forbidden. Prohibition had turned the act of going out for a drink into a full-fledged rebellion, and people were flocking to speakeasies not just for the whiskey, but for the lifestyle. The excitement of secrecy, the rush of defying the law, was almost as intoxicating as the gin being served. This wasn't your typical bar scene. No, speakeasies had an aura about them, a certain je ne sais quoi, that made them the place to be. To the average Joe, just getting in the door felt like you were part of something exclusive, something that most people weren't cool enough to be a part of. Imagine this. You're walking down a dimly lit street, your heart racing just a little faster than usual because you know what's waiting for you. You've got the password tucked in your pocket, ready to whisper it to the doorman who's guarding the entrance to a world of jazz, gin, and mystery. A few knocks on the door and, boom, you're in. Inside, it's a different world. The air smells like whiskey. The sound of the jazz band fills the space, and everyone is dancing like they don't have a care in the world. But you know better. You know you're breaking the law, and that makes the experience even sweeter. You're not just some average person enjoying a night out. You're a part of something bigger, something underground, something that everyone else wishes they could be a part of but can't. Speakeasies weren't just bars. They were symbols of defiance. They represented the idea that the government couldn't control people's desire to have fun. Sure, they passed the laws. Sure, they tried to shut everything down. but no law could stop people from having a good time. And that's why speakeasies became a beacon for anyone who wanted to be part of the rebellion, to feel like they were on the inside of a secret society. In a world where it seemed like everything was regulated, what you could drink, what you could wear, where you could go, these underground clubs were a sanctuary for those who didn't want to follow the rules. But here's the thing about the underground lifestyle. It wasn't just about being rebellious. It was also about being part of something cool. In a society where the old guard was still clinging to their Victorian values, the flappers, the jazz musicians, and the bootleggers represented a new kind of freedom, one that didn't apologize for having fun. The speakeasy wasn't just a place to get drunk. It was a place where you could let loose, be yourself, and take a break from the stuffy, law-abiding world that still existed outside those hidden walls. You weren't just sipping a drink. You were making a statement. You were showing that you weren't afraid to live life on your own terms. And let's not forget about the social element. Sure, it was illegal, but there was something intoxicating about the secrecy of it all. Imagine walking into a speakeasy and seeing your neighbors, your boss, or even the local judge all sitting there, sipping gin and ignoring the world outside. The speakeasy was the ultimate equalizer. It didn't matter if you were a banker or a bootlegger, you were all part of the same underground culture. Everyone was in on the same secret, and that shared experience made the whole thing feel even more thrilling. You weren't just going to a bar, you were joining a society of rebels, each of you united by your desire to push back against the constraints of prohibition. The allure of the speakeasy didn't just end with the drink and the thrill. It extended into the very fabric of culture. Jazz, the music of the time, was inseparable from the speakeasy experience. The music created a vibe, a sense of freedom and joy that matched the rebellious spirit of the underground scene. The way the saxophone howled, the trumpet blared, and the piano keys danced created an atmosphere where you could forget about the outside world and just live in the moment. And that moment felt like something truly special. People didn't just go to speakeasies for the booze. They went for the energy, the music, and the intoxicating sense of breaking free from the norm. In the end, the speakeasy was more than just a place to drink. It was a symbol of everything that was cool about the 1920s. It was a world where the rules didn't apply, where the music was louder than the law, and where everyone was invited to be a part of something bigger than themselves. It was the ultimate underground lifestyle, and it made the Roaring Twenties feel just a little bit wilder, a little bit more rebellious, and a whole lot more fun. And that's exactly why people flocked to them. Because when you're part of a secret club, you're never just a spectator, you're a part of the revolution. And let's be honest, who wouldn't want to be part of that? Trying to stop people from drinking alcohol during Prohibition was like trying to stop a wildfire with a squirt gun. It didn't work. It never worked. People found new and inventive ways to get their booze, and law enforcement found new and inventive ways to lose every battle. The reality of Prohibition was that much like trying to hold back a tidal wave with a sandcastle, the government's attempts at enforcing this law were doomed from the start. Prohibition didn't stop drinking. It just made it more exciting. It turned the illegal alcohol trade into a game, and it was a game that the government couldn't win, no matter how many raids they staged or how many laws they passed. Think about it. You're living in the 1920s, and suddenly the government tells you that you can't drink alcohol anymore. Now imagine someone telling you that today. What would your first reaction be? If you're like most people, you'd probably find a way to get around it, right? You'd find that one friend who knows a guy, and before you know it, you're back to drinking your favorite cocktail, but now you're doing it in secret. That's exactly what happened in the 1920s. People didn't suddenly lose their desire for alcohol. No, they just became more resourceful. The underground alcohol trade exploded, with bootleggers, moonshiners, and speakeasy owners all scrambling to meet the demand. And let's not forget about the fact that people loved breaking the rules. It became a sort of underground sport. Who could find the best booze, who could get away with it the longest, and who could throw the best party while avoiding the law. In the face of this rising tide of resistance, law enforcement struggled to keep up. Sure, they tried their best. Federal agents, police, and even the military were brought in to help curb the alcohol trade. But every time they shut one operation down, another one popped up. It was like whack-a-mole, and every time they hit one, another would rise in its place. These agents weren't just chasing criminals, they were chasing ghosts. For every person they arrested, there were 10 more waiting in the wings to take their place. The people involved in bootlegging were slick, savvy, and always a step ahead. You couldn't catch what you couldn't see, and by the time Prohibition was in full swing, the black market was so ingrained in everyday life that it was nearly impossible to put an end to it. To make matters worse, the law enforcement agencies tasked with stopping the flow of illegal booze often found themselves outmatched. Corruption was rampant. You had police officers, judges, and even politicians taking bribes to turn a blind eye to illegal activities. Bootleggers were making so much money that buying off a few local cops or politicians was a small price to pay for keeping the operation running smoothly. It wasn't just the criminals getting rich, it was the very people who were supposed to be stopping them. So while the government was busy spending its resources trying to stop people from having fun, the real money was being made by those who had figured out how to work the system. Let's not forget about the creativity of the people involved in bootlegging. These weren't just guys running alcohol across state lines. They were problem solvers. They figured out how to get booze into cities, sometimes using secret tunnels, fake shipments, and ingenious hiding places. One of the most famous examples was how they would hide alcohol in hollowed-out canes, fake furniture, and even inside crates marked with the word apples. Yes, apples, because apparently, who would ever suspect a shipment of fruit? But that's the thing about Prohibition. It turned crime into an art form. The more the government cracked down, the more creative the criminals became. And the more creative the criminals got, the more exciting it became for the average person who was just trying to get their hands on a drink. This underground system of smuggling, selling, and drinking turned into a full-blown game, and it was a game that, let's face it, the government was never going to win. In the end, Prohibition wasn't about stopping people from drinking. It was about pushing alcohol into the hands of criminals, creating a whole underground economy where the only people who truly profited were the ones willing to break the law. It wasn't about making the world safer or healthier. It was about making alcohol more expensive, more exciting, and more dangerous. It was a classic case of the law of unintended consequences. And while Prohibition may have ended in 1933 with the repeal of the 18th Amendment, the damage was already done. The demand for illegal alcohol had been ingrained into society, and the country had learned that when you make something illegal, you don't stop people from wanting it. You just make it more thrilling to get. So next time someone talks about Prohibition, just remember, it wasn't about stopping drinking. It was about making it a whole lot more exciting. And as history shows us, if you want to stop people from doing something, don't outlaw it. Just make it a little more difficult to get, and watch everyone start breaking the rules in style. Everyone had a secret to keep during Prohibition, whether it was about where the nearest speakeasy was, or how much they paid for a bottle of hooch. And the best part? Almost no one could keep their secrets for long. The entire era was built on secrecy, and the game was simple. Everyone was in on it, and no one was talking about it. Unless, of course, they had a drink in hand and the feds were nowhere in sight. Prohibition may have been an attempt to control society's drinking habits, but in reality, it just turned secrecy into a commodity. The more hidden the party, the more fun it seemed to be. The thrill wasn't just in breaking the law, it was in keeping it under wraps, pretending to be part of a society that was constantly looking over its shoulder, wondering who might spill the beans. Think about it. The whole speakeasy system was built on a network of people who knew someone else who could get you inside. You couldn't just walk into these places. No, you had to earn your way in. It wasn't just about paying for a drink. It was about paying your dues to be part of this secret club. And of course, everyone knew a guy who knew a guy. Your average Joe wasn't going to waltz into a speakeasy without the right connections. These places weren't like bars today, open to all, with a neon sign inviting you in. They were more like a secret society, and the only way to get in was by knowing the password or having a friend who vouched for you. But here's the kicker. While everyone was trying to keep the secret, everyone also wanted to talk about it. It's human nature. Tell someone they can't do something, and they'll want to do it even more. But here's the rub. No secret stays secret forever. And when it came to Prohibition, there were so many people involved in the game that it was practically impossible to keep everything under wraps. There were the bootleggers, the speakeasy owners, the bartenders, the corrupt cops, the politicians, and of course, the patrons. Everyone had a part to play. Some people were just looking for a good time, others for profit, and a few, especially the ones on the inside, had other motivations. No matter how careful you were, the more people involved in a secret, the more likely it was to spill. Someone would always slip up. Maybe it was the bartender who'd had one too many drinks himself. Maybe it was the politician who couldn't resist boasting about his latest off-the-books deal. Or maybe it was the cop who, after collecting enough bribes, finally realized he was doing more for the bootleggers than he was for the law. Whatever the case, secrets have a funny way of getting out, especially when you've got a room full of people who are all in on the same thing, but still playing it cool in front of each other. One of the most fascinating parts of Prohibition was how the secrecy created a strange sense of camaraderie among people who might never have crossed paths otherwise. Imagine being an average citizen, someone who just wanted to unwind after work with a nice drink. Now, because of Prohibition, you're suddenly a member of an underground world, a part of something bigger than yourself, even if you're only in it for the gin. It didn't matter that you were just an accountant. You were now part of a covert operation, ducking into back alleys, giving secret handshakes, and hoping that no one from the local government would catch wind of where you were headed. The secrecy was addictive, and it made you feel like you were living on the edge, part of a rebellion, without ever really having to do anything illegal yourself. You were in on the secret, and that was enough to give you a sense of pride, even if your biggest crime was sneaking a bottle of hooch into your home. And then there were the people who couldn't keep the secret, or maybe didn't want to. These were the folks who couldn't resist bragging about their illegal nightlife to the wrong person, letting slip where the best speakeasies were located, or even discussing their business dealings over lunch. Prohibition didn't just make people break the law, it made them talk about it. It was like an unspoken competition. Who could get away with the most? Who could keep the secret the longest? And who could tell the best story about how they had snuck into a secret bar under the nose of the authorities? The moment someone started to get too cocky about it, they were bound to slip up. And sure enough, once the wrong person heard something, it was only a matter of time before the feds would come knocking. But let's not forget the real secret keepers, the people in charge of running the speakeasies and the bootleggers who were making money hand over fist. They were the ones with the most to lose, but also the most to gain. These people were incredibly good at playing the game, keeping everything locked down tight, watching every movement, and making sure the operation ran smoothly. They knew that one slip-up could mean disaster, so they were always on alert. The more covert the operation, the more money they made. And yet, despite their best efforts, the secrecy was never truly impenetrable. They could control their network, but they couldn't control the growing curiosity, the increasing number of people who were starting to ask, what's so special about these secret bars? Eventually, the cat was out of the bag, and the authorities knew that this underground world wasn't just a nuisance. It was an empire, a rapidly growing, hard-to-reach empire. In the end, Prohibition's secret wasn't just about keeping things hush-hush. It was about the thrill of being in on something that nobody else knew. It was about the danger, the defiance, and the unspoken unity of people who just wanted a drink and a little rebellion. The secret might have been hard to keep, but the excitement of the hidden world it created, that was something everyone could share. And that's probably why, in the end, the whole thing came crashing down. Because secrets have a funny way of escaping, and when they do, the world changes forever. A night out in a speakeasy was like a VIP pass to the world's best party, only you had to lie about who you were, hide your identity, and hope you didn't run into a cop. But hey, at least the drinks were strong enough to make you forget you were breaking the law. You could say that speakeasies weren't just bars. They were exclusive little underground worlds where everyone was, in their own way, somebody. It didn't matter if you were a factory worker, a judge, or a mobster. You were part of the same secret society, sipping illegal liquor and dancing to jazz like the law didn't exist. The best part about the speakeasy wasn't just the booze, it was the sense of belonging. Everyone in that room was there for the same reason, to have a good time, to escape from the pressures of a world that didn't want them to drink, dance, or live freely. And even though they were all living on borrowed time, hiding behind false identities, they couldn't help but feel like they were living in a story. Every night was a chance to be someone else, to escape from whatever dull or oppressive life they led by day. In the darkness of a speakeasy, you could be whoever you wanted to be. Maybe you were a high society businessman who just needed a break. Maybe you were a rebellious young woman in a fringe dress, catching the eye of the room with every step you took. Maybe you were the mysterious guy with the fedora and a sharp jawline, trying to act like you weren't really a bootlegger. For those few hours, none of that mattered. You were somebody, and that's all that mattered in that moment. But getting into a speakeasy wasn't as simple as just showing up. Oh no, It was more like entering an exclusive club where your name on the guest list didn't matter nearly as much as the password you had. And it wasn't just about getting into the speakeasy, it was about how you got in. Did you have the right knock? Did you know the secret phrase? Was your invitation passed down from friend to friend, from shady businessman to mobster, from one rebel to the next? You had to prove you were worthy of entering this underground world, and once you were in, you were instantly a part of something bigger than yourself. It was almost like a little microcosm of defiance, a space where society's rules didn't apply, but where everyone still played by the same secret code. And once you were in, you could forget about the troubles of the outside world. The air was thick with jazz, the clink of glasses, and the murmur of hushed conversations. The piano played, the trumpet blared, and for a few moments, everyone forgot they were breaking the law. But let's be real. While the music was free-flowing, so was the danger. Every drink, every laugh, every dance could be the one that caught the attention of the cops. One wrong move, and the party was over. Yet somehow, that danger only made everything more exciting. The law was just a whisper on the other side of the door. As long as you were in the speakeasy, you were in control. The drinks were strong, the jazz was loud, and the whole world outside seemed so far away. And it wasn't just about the alcohol or the music. It was about feeling untouchable, like you were part of something that couldn't be taken away. Speakeasies weren't just about the socializing either. They were where people could network in the most unconventional way. You could be rubbing elbows with gangsters, politicians, and businessmen, all while sipping on a drink that was worth more than gold. Imagine getting business tips from a bootlegger or receiving legal advice from someone who knew a thing or two about bending the law. These spaces were buzzing with the movers and shakers of society, all bound by the same secret. They were drinking and dancing, all while trying not to get caught. It was a world where anything seemed possible, and everyone had a story. The characters you met at a speakeasy weren't just ordinary. They were living out a tale that was as daring as the drinks they were knocking back. Some were running away from their past, others were trying to escape their future, but all of them were finding solace in the present moment, dancing away their fears and leaving their worries at the door. And let's talk about the culture of secrecy. The whole vibe of the speakeasy was built around being in the know. Everyone who entered had to be part of a little hidden circle, a world where everyone's name wasn't just known, but guarded. You didn't go into a speakeasy unless you knew what was at stake. You didn't show up without understanding the risk involved. And once you were in, you were part of the family. You shared the thrill, the excitement, and the undeniable feeling of being a part of something larger than yourself. No matter who you were never just a patron. You were a member of this underground society, and that was what made it so intoxicating in this end. Speakeasies were more than just a place to get a drink. They were the lifeblood of the Roaring Twenties, a symbol of rebellion, freedom, and the power of secrecy. And while the rest of society was stuck following the rules, the people who frequented these hidden bars got to experience the world in a way that felt more exciting, more dangerous, and more free. The jazz was playing, the drinks were flowing, and everyone was somebody, at least for a night. It was almost like a game for the people in the know, how to sneak in, how to dodge the feds, and how to make sure your drink was served before anyone had a chance to ask you for your papers. Prohibition wasn't just a law, it was a challenge, and everyone loved a good challenge. It wasn't enough to just get your hands on alcohol. You had to do it in a way that made you feel like you were outsmarting the entire establishment, including the government. Every sip of whiskey in a speakeasy was a little victory against the system, and the thrill of knowing that you were breaking the law added to the excitement. It was the ultimate high-stakes game, one where the winners were those who managed to outwit the authorities, outlast the busts, and keep the good times rolling. For the average person, getting into a speakeasy was a matter of knowing the right people, having the right password, and most importantly, keeping your cool when you were under pressure. The doorman didn't just check your name, they checked your whole demeanor. You had to look the part, act the part, and never look nervous. One false move, 1 second of hesitation, and you might find yourself escorted out of the club, or worse, arrested. But for those who were good at the game, it became second nature. If you had the right password, the right knock, or just the right look, you could slide through the door like you were part of the club. Because for all intents and purposes, you were. The real trick wasn't just getting in, it was staying in without raising suspicion. But the challenges didn't end once you got past the door. Oh no, getting in was the easy part. The real test came when the feds were on the prowl. Speakeasy owners and bartenders had to be quick on their feet, always prepared to shut down the operation the second they saw a cop in the vicinity. The setup was elaborate. False walls, hidden compartments, and secret exits, all designed to make it easier to evade the law. The staff didn't just serve drinks. They played the role of secret agents, constantly watching the door, ready to tip off the patrons at a moment's notice if the cops were closing in. These weren't your typical bartenders. These were people who had perfected the art of running an illegal business while keeping up the appearance of running a legitimate one. It wasn't just about the staff either. The patrons were part of the game too. They had to be on the lookout, always aware of who was entering the speakeasy, who was lurking outside, and most importantly, who was actually law enforcement. One wrong word, one misplaced glance, and the whole place could be shut down in a matter of minutes. Imagine sitting at a table, casually chatting with your friends, but all the while scanning the room, checking for the slightest sign of danger. Maybe someone's wearing a little too much cologne. Maybe they're acting too eager to order a drink. They could be feds in disguise, and you wouldn't know until it was too late. The game was always on, and everyone had to be vigilant if they wanted to keep having their drinks without getting caught. And the cops? They had a tough time keeping up. It wasn't for lack of trying. The feds had their own tactics, infiltrating the speakeasy scene with undercover agents. But no matter how many informants they sent in, the speakeasies were always a step ahead. One of the tricks used by speakeasy owners was rotating the locations frequently. One night, you might go to a basement on 5th Street, and the next, you'd be in a back room behind a Chinese restaurant on 3rd Avenue. If the authorities got wind of one location, the whole operation could move, leaving the cops scrambling to catch up. It was like playing hide and seek with the law, but the speakeasy owners were experts at hiding, while the feds were stuck trying to find the right hiding spot. But let's not forget about the bootleggers who were supplying the alcohol. They were masters of evasion too. They didn't just smuggle alcohol from one place to another, they made sure to do it in the most creative ways possible. Whiskey was hidden in everything from hollowed-out logs to secret compartments in cars, and the deliveries were timed with precision. You had to be fast, precise, and always aware of who was watching. One slip-up, and the whole operation could collapse. But the thrill of getting away with it was addictive, and it made the bootlegging business boom. The more creative the evasion tactics, the bigger the reward. After all, when you're smuggling illegal alcohol in the middle of the night, it's not just about avoiding the cops, it's about building an empire. At the end of the day, Prohibition was less about stopping drinking and more about creating an entire underground network that outwitted the government at every turn. People didn't just break the law, they turned it into a game, one where the rules didn't matter and the stakes were high. And as long as there were people willing to risk it all for a drink, the game would continue, with each side trying to outsmart the other. It was a battle of wits, of nerve, and of knowing when to run and when to hide. And in that constant game of cat and mouse, everyone had a role to play, whether they were the ones drinking the booze or the ones trying to stop it. But no matter how many times the feds tried to shut it down, the underground lived on, thriving in a world where the only rule was that the party never stopped. By the time Prohibition ended, people were tired of sneaking around. The government realized it wasn't worth the fight, and frankly, people were starting to forget why they even cared about the rules in the first place. And so, after 13 years, the law fell apart like a house of cards. What started as an attempt to curb alcohol consumption had morphed into one of the most spectacular failures in American history, not just because of the defiance it spurred, but because of the growing realization that the law was only creating more problems than it was solving. The public had had enough of playing cat and mouse with the authorities, and the government had had enough of throwing money at a losing battle. Prohibition, which began in 1920 with the 18th Amendment, was initially backed by well-meaning temperance movements that wanted to clean up society, believing that banning alcohol would eliminate crime and improve public health. It seemed like a noble cause. But what actually happened was the opposite. The demand for alcohol didn't go away. It went underground. And when something is made illegal, it's only natural that people will find a way to get it. Speakeasies, bootleggers, and underground networks grew exponentially, and with them, organized crime became a cornerstone of American society. The very thing that Prohibition sought to eliminate, drinking, was flourishing more than ever, but now it came with a side of danger and secrecy. But as the years dragged on, people began to tire of the constant risk. Every sip of illegal gin, every knock on the door, every under-the-table transaction added a layer of stress to what should have been a simple pleasure. And then there was the quality of the booze. For the average citizen, what they got wasn't a fine glass of aged whiskey. It was homemade, sometimes toxic moonshine that tasted more like regret than refreshment. Even the rich, who could afford better, found that the constant need for secrecy made it a hassle just to enjoy a drink. Over time, the thrill of breaking the law wore off. People grew weary of the deceit, the hiding, and the constant fear of getting caught. The same government that had pushed the law through couldn't keep up with its enforcement, and the public began to lose faith in the idea that Prohibition was actually working. And then there were the economic consequences. Prohibition might have sounded like a good idea in theory, but in practice it was a nightmare. The government lost out on a massive source of tax revenue from alcohol sales, while an entire black market was thriving. What could have been taxed and regulated was instead being funneled into illegal channels, enriching gangsters and criminals while starving the economy. The alcohol industry was one of the largest in the country, and with it shut down, millions of dollars were lost every year. The government was also spending billions trying to enforce a law that was getting harder and harder to follow. it became clear that prohibition was not only ineffective, but also damaging to the economy. The public's growing frustration with prohibition didn't go unnoticed. The country was in the midst of the Great Depression, and the idea of legalizing alcohol became increasingly popular. It was a way to create jobs, stimulate the economy, and frankly, give people something to look forward to in tough times. The idea of taxing alcohol, creating jobs in breweries and distilleries, and bringing in revenue for a cash-strapped government seemed like a no-brainer. The country was financially struggling, and the promise of a new industry that could offer jobs and stability was too tempting to resist. People wanted a return to normalcy, and the end of prohibition offered a way to get there. The public had spoken. They were tired of hiding their booze, tired of the underground dealings, and tired of the constant game of outwitting the authorities. As the country began to realize that the prohibition experiment had failed, a movement to repeal the 18th Amendment gained traction. The repeal effort was led by those who understood that the law had only fostered more crime, more corruption, and more economic damage. It was a matter of practical necessity. In 1933, the 21st Amendment was passed, effectively ending prohibition. And just like that, alcohol was legal again. Bars reopened, breweries began brewing, and distilleries got back to business. People could finally buy a drink without having to sneak around like it was some kind of dangerous sport. When prohibition came to an end, it was met with relief and celebration. Speakeasies shut their doors for good, and the underground world that had flourished for over a decade was dismantled. People flooded back into the legal bars and clubs, eager to taste the freedom they'd been denied for so long. The excitement wasn't just about alcohol, it was about the return of a simpler time when people could enjoy a drink in public without fear of being arrested. The party that had been forced into the shadows was finally allowed to come back into the light, and for many, it was a taste of victory. In the end, prohibition's collapse wasn't just a victory for alcohol, it was a victory for common sense. The country had learned that you can't legislate morality, and you certainly can't legislate something as popular and ingrained in society as alcohol. Prohibition had tried to change the behavior of an entire nation, but all it did was create more problems than it solved. The fizz that had seemed so thrilling at first quickly lost its sparkle, and the law collapsed under its own weight. And while it was a hard-fought battle for both sides, the end of prohibition brought with it the promise of a new era, one where people could finally enjoy their drinks without looking over their shoulder. Even after prohibition ended, speakeasies didn't just disappear. In fact, they evolved, taking on new forms in the world of cocktail culture. So next time you walk into a hidden bar, remember, you're standing on the shoulders of bootleggers who just wanted to have a good time. The allure of secrecy, of being part of an underground world, didn't vanish with the end of prohibition. Instead, it transformed, taking on a new life in the vibrant cocktail scene that followed. Those hidden, dimly lit rooms where people once gathered to break the law became the foundation of the sophisticated, speakeasy-inspired bars we flock to today. But the spirits of those original speakeasies, the thrill of being part of something exclusive, the excitement of sneaking into a forbidden world, lives on, albeit with a slightly more polished touch. After the repeal of Prohibition in 1933, the speakeasies, by their very nature, couldn't just fade away. They had become symbols of rebellion and freedom, and people weren't ready to let go of that feeling. In fact, as alcohol became legal again, the speakeasy ethos was so ingrained in the culture that it began to morph into a more refined, yet still secretive, part of the nightlife scene. Bars started adopting the atmosphere of speakeasies, dark, intimate spaces, hidden away from the hustle of everyday life, where patrons could still feel like they were part of something special. The concept of a hidden gem bar emerged, where the thrill of exclusivity still persisted, but without the threat of getting arrested. These new speakeasies weren't just places to grab a drink. They were spaces to escape, to experience something different, something a little dangerous, without the consequences. As the cocktail culture began to thrive in the post-Prohibition years, many former speakeasy owners turned their hidden spots into upscale establishments, embracing the flair and drama that had originally made speakeasies so appealing. The once illicit activity of mixing and serving fancy drinks became a legitimate, booming industry. It wasn't just about a shot of gin or whiskey anymore. It was about crafting complex cocktails that tantalized the taste buds and provided an experience. The old speakeasy's tradition of secrecy carried over into the creation of secret or reservation-only bars, where patrons would need a password or a hidden door to enter. This added another layer of mystique, reminding everyone that the secret world wasn't fully gone. It had simply been repackaged, refined, and made just a little more fashionable. Let's talk about the drinks for a moment. During Prohibition, the goal was simple: get a drink, any drink, and get drunk. The alcohol was often subpar, bathtub gin was far from a fine cocktail, and the focus was on quantity over quality. But post-Prohibition, the artistry of cocktails began to take center stage. Bartenders became revered as true artists, able to mix together spirits and flavors in ways that were never before possible. The classic cocktails that emerged, like the martini, the old-fashioned, and the Manhattan, were served with a sense of class and style that was missing during the Prohibition days. Yet they still carried the same underground spirit of rebellion. After all, every drink served was a tribute to the idea that people could make their own rules and escape the rigid structures of society. While the alcohol was now legal, the experience of the speakeasy, its exclusivity and sense of mystery, still held a special place in the hearts of those who had lived through Prohibition. Even after the law had caught up with reality, people still craved that sense of danger and excitement. There was something special about slipping into a hidden bar, being greeted with a knowing smile, and ordering a drink that was served in a space so far removed from the everyday world. It was about more than just the alcohol. It was about the experience. It was about knowing that for just a few hours, you were part of something larger than yourself, something rebellious, a little bit forbidden, and full of life. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the speakeasy isn't just in the hidden bars of today. It's in the spirit of defiance they left behind. The Prohibition era proved that no matter how hard you try to suppress something, the desire for freedom and rebellion will find a way to flourish. Speakeasies weren't just about drinking illegally. They were a statement. They said, "We'll have what we want when we want it, and you can't stop us." And that ethos, that desire to find a little corner of the world where the rules don't apply, is still alive today. From underground cocktail bars with secretive entrances to trendy speakeasy-inspired lounges, we still seek out that thrill of being part of a secret. It's like a badge of honor, being in the know, being part of an exclusive crowd, and embracing the feeling that just for a little while, we're not bound by the same rules as everyone else. So the next time you step into one of these hidden bars with the dim lighting, the secret codes, and the expertly crafted cocktails, remember this: You're partaking in the legacy of the speakeasy, a legacy that emerged from an era of prohibition and rebellion and still holds the same allure today. You're not just enjoying a drink, you're experiencing a piece of history that refuses to fade, a piece of history that proves no matter how hard society tries to keep something underground, it will always find a way to resurface in the most unexpected ways. Cheers to that. As we close the chapter on Prohibition, it's hard not to appreciate the resilience, creativity, and downright audacity of those who lived through it. The jazz, the speakeasies, the bootleggers, and the flappers all came together to create one of the most rebellious and lively eras in American history. Sure, it may have been illegal, dangerous, and often a little absurd, but it was also a time of unprecedented cultural change and defiance. People weren't just breaking the law, they were redefining the very concept of freedom and fun. So the next time you find yourself in a cozy bar, sipping on your favorite drink, take a moment to reflect on the rebels who came before us. They took risks, outwitted the authorities, and made history by simply doing what they loved, living life on their own terms. From hidden doors to secret knocks, from the bootleggers to the jazz bands, Prohibition wasn't just a law, it was a movement. And while the era ended, its spirit lived on in the cocktail culture, the underground nightlife, and the enduring legacy of those who dared to push the boundaries of what society said was acceptable. As we sip on our drinks tonight, legally, of course, let's honor the rebels of the Roaring Twenties who taught us that sometimes the best way to live is by challenging the rules, pushing against the norm, and finding joy in the unexpected. So here's to the past, the wild and wonderful 20s, and to never forgetting that the most exciting moments in life are often the ones that break all the rules. Cheers and good night. May your dreams be filled with jazz and mystery, just like the nights of the Roaring Twenties. Okay, good night.